Hey, reason we're here, this panel is to talk about war, and specifically the human dimension of war. And so we're gonna, like all good processes, I'm just gonna refresh our memory and why, and what is our goal, what is our vision. And I propose to us, as was mentioned earlier, that we need soldiers who maintain the will to fight, continuing through victory and transitioning home well. And so our task this morning, this panel, is to discuss how we can better prepare our soldiers for the eventuality of ground combat. Marine General Rupertus said in the interwar years, when the smoke clears, it is the man with the bayonet who settles the issue on the field. And even in our high-tech society, as we push the envelope on many things, war is still a human endeavor, putting incredible demands on our men and women. Just one anecdote from history to kind of frame the discussion. During the Battle of Okinawa in World War II, in 82 days of ground combat, we evacuated 26,000 service members off the island for what we termed then as neuropsychiatric issues. I think today we could label them as exhaustion, moral injury, PTSD, and a whole host of other labels that are probably not as important as the fact that humans are complex, sometimes fragile, have limits, and when we put the most stress on them that life could offer, we experience those. And as many experts have posited over the last few years, the eventuality and the possibility of our next fight may well exceed the scope and scale of violence experienced during World War II. And so to help us explore this topic today, we have two panel members with us this morning, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves.
Hi, for those I haven't met, my name is Deydre Teyhen, and I'm so excited to be here today because, as the last panel, General Francis talked about the real importance of global security challenges that we're facing. And it really is important that we win our nation's war because second place is not where we want to be, right? And so the last panel talked about the importance of getting them ready for the fight. This panel is really focused on how do we keep them in the fight, and if they have to leave the fight, how do you quickly return them to the fight when they're deployed? And I think that's where H2F's secret sauce is. And I think we are just on the beginning of understanding how to leverage all these resources to actually truly keep people in the fight and return them to the fight as quickly as possible. And I want to kind of talk about it, when we talk about large-scale combat operations, I think everyone knows from a medical perspective, if we don't have air superiority, we can't medevac or casevac people out of theater. Well, if I don't have air superiority to get those with life, limb, or eyesight out of theater, what's the likelihood I can reconstitute soldiers easily in that space? It's very low. And so the think tanks are saying that the nation state that can optimize return to duty in a deployed LISCO setting is going to be the nation state with the competitive advantage. And what this panel is about is how do we actually leverage these concepts and these principles in a way that really allows us to do what we've always done, is win our nation's wars because of the American sons and daughters who volunteer to serve our nation. And so I'm really excited for this panel. Thank you.
Good morning, thank you. When I first saw the panel I was on, I had to give a quick phone call and make sure that they put me on the right panel. Civilian, can't speak to combat, can't own any part of that. But as my experience, about 45 years in the human performance, physical education, curriculum design, training trainers, trying to own this part of preparation. I started coaching in 1979, about 10 miles away from here, grew up in Washington, D.C. Spent a lot of time working with what they call at-risk youth. When we would sit in a room of at-risk youth, I would laugh at them and say, all youth are at risk, you all just got caught. Now we're going to figure out how we're going to kind of get you back on the right track as we roll forward. I also have experience starting up a couple of charter schools, one in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where we built a curriculum based on physical fitness. To teach them math, history, language, communication. And what we really found out in that setting, both as a teacher and as a coach, that environment offers a unique and a uniquely effective environment to observe behaviors and provide different interventions that we can use physical fitness as a gateway drug or as a gateway communication to have all these other conversations that we've been having as we roll forward. Listening to the panel before, I felt a bit like a fish out of water until I also heard Chaplain Green talk this morning and realized, oh, this is actually what I've been doing for about 45 years. And my goal here is to kind of bring some of the best practices and maybe say a few controversial things, because I think on the big theoretical level, we all agree that all these things are interconnected. I've really focused on how at the very implementation level can we make these things work. My mom used to say, A students run the world, C students come along and fix it. I kind of fell into both buckets. I was a C student at best in high school. As I went into my graduate work at the University of New Mexico, I became an A student, so I see both sides of it. I've really tried to focus more on the C student solutions because we acknowledge from the A student side that all these things make sense, but how do we operationalize them and take a PT session, we call it physical training. When I was teaching physical education, we called it PE. Physical education has to focus more on the education. And I think that can become an opportunity not just for H2F on the physical side, but open up the other domains as well.
Okay, I'm excited to be part of the conversation. Had one more panelist, Dr. Anthony Scroggins, who's he has a PhD in physiological and brain science and and is the research psychologist at the Office of the Chief of Chaplains. But he is sick and contagious. And so I thought it best not to have him here as we talk about H2F. But I'll try to channel him a little as we talk and have this conversation. But we have overlapping experiences here, which is we critically need, because humans are complex. With body, mind, spirit, that can't be understood in isolation. And so we know some things. We know from the research, long-standing research that those who are actively involved in communities of faith have better outcomes, health outcomes, lower behavioral health issues, higher mental performance, all kinds, a host of positive effects. We know those that are settled in their identity, purpose, meaning, and values, which is the essence of spirituality, they can endure, suffer, and overcome better. We know that physical performance is related not only to physical endurance in war, but it's also related to the survivability of a soldier when they are wounded, and the ability to surmount obstacles, both physical and mental. And so this is just a small part of what we know and understand, but we're going to queue up a few questions, and we're going to interact and have a conversation up here that you all get to be a part of. And so with that, I'm just going to lead off. So in the last few years, we've talked a lot about the will to fight. 2018, Rand explored this at length and came up with a complex factors ranging from national, societal, organizational unit down to the individual about what do we know about the will to fight as humans. And so as we look at what it takes to endure ground combat in our soldiers and sustain the will to fight, how would you say your first take is, how does holistic health and fitness relate to that exact outcome?
I'm going to start with the mental domain on this one, and I think it's really interesting to unpack. And if you think about the decades of research in resilience, I think there was a lot of excitement that resilient, and it is true, the more resilient you are, the more you can endure, and the more you can endure, the more grit you have. All that's fantastic. But it wasn't sufficient. And then the next really round of research that came out was really on mindfulness from the Wall Street Army Institute of Research and Dr. Jha. And really, it was really exciting to then apply that. And one of the things that I think is really critical, and you brought it up earlier, it's really about performance, right? So although I, as a healthcare provider, as a physical therapist, love mindfulness because of all the mental health perspectives it gives, what does it mean for the soldier? And as General Francis pointed out earlier, we did the study at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii, and guess what? Those folks that were doing mindfulness at least 3 days a week, they performed a lot better on a stress shoot. Well, now I can actually get them excited about coming into this mental domain with me about resilience and mindfulness, because there's actually a performance outcome that they can actually physically see that they're actually doing better in a stress shoot because we taught them how to control their mind, how to control their anxiety, how to focus, and actually how to be present in the moment. But I also don't think that's sufficient. And that's when Dr. Lisa Miller's work came in that I think is really amazing. If you read her book on the awakened mind, the awakened brain, it's really fascinating because she was noticing that her patients, even with all that we've learned in mental and behavioral health, was not enough until she stumbled on the fact that maybe there's this inner reaction between spiritual fitness and resilience that really is where the secret sauce is. And so she's measured this, and to just kind of tell you the outcome, what she's found is that when you combine resilience and spiritual fitness, people have better life meaning, they have better grit, they have better optimism, they have better gratitude, they have better forgiveness. And when that happens, the areas in their brain that they make decisions on, the areas in the brain where they make their decision processes grow and develop, which makes you actually better able to make decisions in time of stress. And one of the things that I will close as my fourth kind of thought in this initial question is it does come down to leadership. And because what it changes to go from just a resilient to a spiritual mindset that allows you to unlock that is the difference from thinking about yourself as somebody that has a lot of good abilities to somebody that has inherent worth. Changing the idea as your identity, as something from acquiring successes in the next promotion and what did I accomplish today, to someone that is pursuing meaning and purpose in their life. From thinking about work as your talents and gains versus a calling and a contribution to serve our nation. And your relationships with friends and families, are they helpful, are they satisfying, or are they actually giving you a sacred understanding of personal growth because of how you invest in those relationships? Because as brought up with Dr. Murphy, the Surgeon General, 1 out of 2 Americans are fighting loneliness, and the loneliness epidemic is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day, right? The impact on your health is the equivalent of 15 cigarettes a day to being lonely, right? So when you think about what a leadership role is, it's going back, and Sergeant Major said it in the last one, it's not that just we're doing PT, but the leaders out there making sure they understand their work, they understand their meaning and purpose, they understand they have a calling, and they understand how to fit that in. And that's where the spiritual fitness adds in with the resilience and adds in with the mindfulness to really get us what we really want is soldiers that can endure the challenges of large-scale combat operations.
So I'm going to bring it back to my area, once again, not directly on combat, but this whole idea of preparation. And I'm actually going to suggest that while resilience is critical and it's important and the concept of being able to bounce back after stress, I think we also need to expand the scope to what I and others call robustness as our really first line of defense. And I'll start with the physicality component of it. As we can start to increase the thresholds of our ability to withstand physical stress, where heart rates start to go up, and above a certain level it starts to impede blood flow to the brain, which starts to mean you get oxygen issues up there, which means you get mental clarity issues up there. As you start to see things like respiration go up, so you start to perceive other things going on, and you start to become a little bit more hypercapnic, you have too much CO2, which then starts to affect how you're starting to feel and operate in the spatial environment. How core temperature, as it starts to get to a certain level, can start to trigger things in the central nervous system that shuts down your ability to generate force, your endurance, and once again, your mental clarity. So providing these H2F and these physical components, so soldiers start to understand they can develop and also moderate their physiological responses to physical, environmental, mental, emotional stress. So you start to recognize sooner, oh, why is my heart rate going up? What's this weird feeling I have right here that I haven't really called anxiety before? I just call it life before. What are these things about breath control? What are these things about getting to this thing of mindfulness? And sometimes we find out that depending on the population, you say mindfulness, you say yoga, you've lost them right away. You get them in a high stress environment, and I won't go down too many rabbit holes, but people that have trained before, they have these things called AMRAP, as many reps as possible or as many rounds as possible. Well, we modify that a little bit, and we say an AMRAP 120, meaning that we give you a series of exercises, and you're trying to see how many rounds you can get through in 20 minutes, but you're not able to start your next round until your heart rate comes down to 120. And we can talk about offline about why we pick 120. First time you go through, not a big deal. Second time you go through, starts to real. At a certain point, if you're working hard enough, Your heart rate's staying up high, and now I can come in and say, hey, here's some ideas on how to get your heart rate down. Let's talk about nasal breathing. Let's talk about shaking things out. Let's about getting your mind in the right place, because the sooner you can get your heart rate down, the sooner you can start that next round, and so your score is better. So now we've gamified this whole idea of getting self-control, and that starts to open up this idea of mindfulness. Hey, when you start to feel these things happening in others' environments, you now have the tools and skills that you can rely back on to get you into a better state to then be able to take on these other concepts that we're trying to teach.
I want to add to what Chris said, because it's really interesting. It's an older study, but they looked at the difference between elite professional athletes and just regular professional athletes, right? People in the pros versus people that are like superstars we all think of. And what they found is that the difference between the regular professional athletes and the elite were those that actually had the better control of their heart rate variability. And they were able to, like, if you think about tennis, they run, hit the shot, but then as they are in between shots, they bring their heart rate down so they can look at the whole environment and be able to assess where the ball is going to go next, right? And that actually allows them to do the ability to respond more. When you think about that from our lens, that's what we want with our soldiers, is that they can actually take in what's happening in a large-scale combat operation, because yes, they might have to rush the contact, and then they have to be able to take their breath, get their heart rate down, reassess where they're at to make the next decision. And when Lieutenant General Pyatt was the division commander at 10th Mountain, he said that that was one of the traits that allowed him to make better decisions as a division commander that brought more of his soldiers home from combat, because he actually, in the thick of it, was able to take a moment, get your heart rate down, take a moment to assess the ascent, and make a better decision. And so I just wanted to foot stomp what you said, because it was so wonderful. But I just think it's something that sometimes can get lost on how important that heart rate variability is. And it might be easier to sell heart rate variability than mindfulness and meditation when you're talking to soldiers, right? And so you have to think about it from a different lens.
I'm going to layer,
That's great.
I'm going to layer one more on top of that as she started to talk about the difference between good and elite athletes. The other thing we know about good and elite athletes is they have the ability to relax muscles faster, coming off of contraction, so then you can go up again. So if we look at heart rate variability, we look at perception, we look at mental clarity, we look at being able to relax muscles. This comes back to this whole idea of the central nervous system as this nexus of physiological, psychological, emotional, and being able to then hone this whole thing that we call brain, or we call mindfulness, and that, you know, some of the geeky science people call this whole idea of central nervous system. The better I can have awareness and control of that in controlled environments and start to have structured, progressive, more adversity, the better I am going to be, once again, in a sports environment, in a danger environment, once again, not combat. I have some other danger environments. This is a beer or two that we'd have to have a conversation around. But understanding what those signs and symptoms feel like, and instead of then panicking because something is happening to me, I now have better control over my physiology, which then will help back on my neurology and my behavior.
Well, you both brought up great points, and it really goes to the point of when our pulse is high, when we're getting shot at, knee deep in hand grenade pins and running out of ideas, you descend to the level of your training, which we say all the time. Now, from a chaplain perspective, there's no. It's like the Chinese proverb, right? The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today, right? We can always start. But it goes to the point of what do we do in all the domains? And you all both mentioned the mindfulness piece and different. What do we do in all the domains to prep ourselves for that day when a late start is not good enough?
You know, when I think about that, I think about actually going back to my time at Schofield Barracks, and at the time General Cavoli was the commanding general, and he tasked Steve Peck, the chaplain, Steve Dawson, the garrison commander, and I to figure out how do we, at the time we called it the CHPIC, or the Community Health Promotion Council. It's now the CR2C. We've changed the name of it, but how do we rethink how we do that venue so that what we hardwire in garrison will be hardwired when we go to war. And so the last panel talked about that, and we often think about them just getting us ready for the fight, but we really need to hardwire those procedures in so that we actually can get after it in a deployed setting. I'm gonna give you a great example as a physical therapist. You know, the earlier we see you for a musculoskeletal injury, the earlier we can get after that musculoskeletal injury, and the earlier we can get to return to duty. When Patrick Mahomes went down in a division title game, they made a risk decision on risk to mission, risk to force with his high ankle sprain. And the decision was, it's a division title game, we're gonna keep him in the fight. And they won 2 Super Bowls since, right? Right decision. If he had a hangnail in preseason, they would have pulled him. As a culture, we have not had those discussions about risk to mission, risk to force routinely in garrison. So if I have a tank crew getting ready to go qualify, and that one person on the tank crew has back pain, do I take them off profile so they can actually go out and qualify, knowing that when they come back, I might have to put him back on profile, and it might add a week to his recovery? We don't have, as a culture, as a community, those conversations. And I think we have to think through the lens of H2F, of how do we think through it from a LISCO environment so that we optimize performance by actually ensuring those things we can do today that cost $0, we're doing in garrison, so that when we're in the deployed setting, someone that comes up with a minor musculoskeletal injury doesn't think they have to get redeployed from theater. 45% of all those that were medevaced out of Desert Shield, Desert Storm, by the time they landed in CONUS, needed no additional health care. We can't afford to have people being pulled from theater that don't need any more health care, because we haven't had those conversations on risk to mission, risk to force, and how to do that while in contact. Last year, Fort Bliss was the first to bring their H2F unit to Fort Irwin, NTC. Since then, we've had a few other units bring their H2F with them to the training centers. But I don't think I think we have to really give thought to how do we optimize that so we really keep people in the fight, and if they do have something that they need to take a knee, that we return them quickly, because we know early intervention equals early identification equals early intervention equals early return to duty.
I think it's funny you're looking at me, but I will try and answer this once again in my context. As I think back to the RAND study and the illustration you provided us early coming in, my other area of expertise is really statistics, research, design, and kind of advanced analytics. And as you start to look at that web of all the things that are impacting the will to fight, the fact that sometimes I pick up research and we're looking at, I hate to say it, but like antiquated analytic approaches as opposed to looking at these neural net and the capabilities we have with, I know, AI and ML, what's coming up forward. I think that's one area, but really to come back to this whole idea of fact-informed decision-making that makes an impact in this context. In some places you hear people say context is king. Really, context is the kingdom. How do we start to make these decisions on the H2F side of a 17 to 22-year-old who's coming in, who literally has never really had any kind of structured adversity? So they have a different relationship with discomfort, with failure, and kind of this iterative approach to evolution and growth. How do we start to make those decisions now that, once again, hangnail in preseason versus high ankle sprain in the playoffs? And how do we start to get not just the individual soldier, but I think the small unit leader is really the force multiplier of being able to create those environments. And two quick notes that I took down on here. As a coach, as a teacher, one thing that I was taught early on by a mentor is we never teach anything, we never coach anything. Our job is to create an environment where learning can take place. When I was standing up schools, we learned that the 3 most important things in school effectiveness is 1, leadership, which they look at as principal. Second one was ongoing professional education by the instructors in the school. And the third one, which I think is the most important one, is peer expectations. If I'm sitting in a room and 75% of the people are going to do this behavior and 25% of the people are going to do this behavior, I'm going with this. And the big takeaway from that, specifically to H2F, is starting to give the H2F teams, and more importantly, the small unit leaders, this idea of your job is to create an environment where people can learn. Because talking ain't teaching and listening ain't learning. You have to be able to implement these measurables that can start to give feedback real time and then moving forward as well.
Well, you mentioned it, like Frankel, we're developing methods to intel, fires, targeting, everything else using AI, machine learning. And as complex as all of those are, human beings are more complex. Is there a way that we can get after that in your thoughts?
So I spent my life trying to figure out how to predict musculoskeletal injuries, right? How do you actually predict who's going to get injured? And the good news is those that are really going to get injured, we can really predict. And those that don't, you can predict the low risk. It's the group in the middle that's challenging. And when you then kind of apply those principles, and again, Dr. Fisher brought up limited dorsiflexion, but limited dorsiflexion is a huge predictor of future injury and many different joints, right? What is those for the mental domain? What are those in the grit, mindfulness domain? And when I went to look at the literature of what we've done in musculoskeletal health to see if the early identification, early intervention, early return to duty literature in the mental domain was there, it's just not as robust. I think we all agree in the principles in that space, that what works in musculoskeletal would work conceptually from a mental domain and would really help keep people in the fight. It's an area that we really need to keep investing in and figuring out how to really do that. And again, the idea is the folks that have a lot of grit and not a lot of grit are usually easy to kind of tease out. It's the group in the middle, how are they going to respond? And that's really where this work gets challenging. It is not the reds and the greens, it's figuring out the ambers that you can turn to green and the ambers you can prevent turning to red. And I think that's where the challenge that we'll probably need help with the industry partners in here is how do we actually do that?
First of all, that's a great answer. That's better than the one I'm about to give. I would say the risk in this area of machine learning and AI is, I'll speak for human performance, we tend to fall in love with technologies or products, and that ends up guiding the questions we can ask and the answers we come up with. I think the mistake I see across human performance, and I've spent quite a bit of time on different bases going through H2F teams as we were designing these sparks, of missing the first step, which is framing the questions, looking at how these questions have been addressed in the past, what solutions are working, where the gaps exist, and then trying to figure out what are the actual decisions we can make that'll have the highest impact, as opposed to the risk of chasing down the wrong metrics or optimizing for the wrong outcomes that we haven't thought about. And these things can go in parallel, and what I see is really a lot of indigenous capital within the Army, because you already do have these high-level logistics and planning, and now you need to get the right stakeholders at the table within Army, within industry, within academia, but really spend the time saying, hey, what are the decisions, what are the most important decisions we want to make? What's the information we need to get there? What's the most economical way? What's the net value we get in terms of what's the amount of value we get out of a procedure versus what's the cost of implementing that procedure? We got to keep that in mind as we roll forward. And it's kind of keeping all those things moving forward at once. I would say the best lessons learned I've seen so far is this whole human-cyber interaction, where the whole idea is not for AI to replace human judgment, but to optimize human judgment. In any place you see computers doing a good job, it's because they have a good interaction with the human component as we roll forward.
Yeah, and it's interesting as championing the spiritual domain, and there was a question earlier, there's a lot of great research out there of trying to quantify what is very hard to quantify. But Dr. Harold Koenig at Duke is doing great work in that space, and Dr. Lisa Miller, as you mentioned, from Columbia. The hardship, I believe, is like most things, gathering the data, gathering the real answers, and maybe, and correct me if I'm wrong, man, but musculoskeletal injuries is pretty easy. I hurt, you're the expert, you tell me what's wrong, and we start delving in the spirit or soul, and sometimes we don't even know what's going on. And it's the same way in the mental domain. And so I think we're gonna get there, but appreciate your responses on that.
Can I actually ask, I'm going to ask
Please.
a question to you two, because
Okay.
you're smarter in these areas than I am. Can we talk about the vicious cycle between if I'm injured, how it affects me mentally, emotionally, and then my mental, emotional state then starts to affect my physical state, which starts to inhibit my ability to recover? And I bet you guys are more prepped than that.
So I'm so glad you asked. So, we can all think of and I like basketball, so you can think of an NBA player that went out with an ACL injury that never returned properly to the game, right? And they had the best surgeon, they should have recovered properly, they had the best recovery, they had the best team, and yet they couldn't get out of their head, or they couldn't worry about getting re-injured, and they just couldn't get back to the same competitive level. Well, when you think about that at the soldier level, what people have done after surgery is you've placed soldiers in a position as they get ready to recover from a surgery. And our injury rates in the Army, again, 52% was shown this morning. Do you know in a professional sports, it's closer to 25%. We have tons more injuries, right? And so getting people back after an injury is really critical. Well, there's a study coming out that was done at our H2F team at JDLM in Washington, and their post-op return to duty rate is through the roof. Like, it is the highest I've seen published anywhere. And what the secret sauce from my perspective is exactly what you're doing, is before they would go to Madigan, do their rehab and come back to their unit. Well, now they're doing the rehab after surgery in the H2F space, and there's the mental domain, the nutrition domain, the sleep domain, and the spiritual domain, and they're all helping these people get back to duty. And again, I wish I would have looked at the study before I walked in, but it's almost 90%. There was like only 2 or 3 people in that study that needed to go to a med board after surgery. And I think we have the opportunity to really tease that out in this space, because we do have the ability to holistically now look at that recovery, where before that would have been considered a physical therapist role to get that soldier back in the fight. And it's much more complicated than that. So thanks for the question.
Great, and I'll speak to the other part. You said, how does that affect people with injuries? And I think it goes back to the spiritual identity, meaning, purpose, our values. And when our identity is tied up in being warriors, and something hinders that, and what we're looking for is a cohesive team. And the more cohesive the team, the more, when you cannot perform as a full member of that team, shakes your identity, shakes your belongingness as part of that team. And that is it's a real factor. If we look back to anecdotally World War II, soldiers were worried and would fight through injuries and wounds that they should have gotten treated for because of our system at the time. Once you got to a certain level of medical treatment, you went into the replacement depot and would find yourself in a completely different division. And they weren't willing to leave the cohesive team that they were a part of. And they were willing to risk their life even further fighting through wounds and not get treated, because they were not willing to leave their friends and leave them hanging and find themselves in a whole new organization. And I would propose that is not just mental, behavioral, that's spiritual at its core, and get to the why. Thanks for the question, that's great. Now, if we're transitioning and fast forward a little bit, Audie Murphy famously said, after the war, we took Army dogs and rehabilitated them for civilian life. But they turned soldiers into civilians immediately and let them sink or swim. Now, we've come a long way, and the return from combat is a little different, but it's always full of challenges. It is always about, from Greek plays until currently, we know that's full of challenges. So as we look about, the end goal is to be victorious and return well. What can our overall health tell us about that process?
Put the pressure on. I would say, once again, staying in my domain, the skills, and you mentioned already, the skills, knowledge, skills, abilities, and attitudes developed early on in H2F and early on in the career need to be kind of that baseline that you return back to. At least you now have some coping skills, understanding this combination of physical and psychological as we roll into. I can't speak to coming back from combat. I have worked with folks coming out of incarceration, folks coming out of gangs, and once again, we started to use the physical component to start to have these conversations. But I 100% defer to you all to address that a little bit more.
So I would like to actually use sleep as the foundation to answer this, and then bring in spiritual on that. So you heard earlier that at 5 days of 5 hours or less sleep, you get a 20% cognitive deficit, which is equivalent of being legally drunk, right? When that study came out, General Odierno was the chief of staff of the Army. He said, "Oh my gosh, my whole staff's drunk by Friday." And we're like, please stop making important decisions Friday afternoon, right? So, but if I apply this to a deployed setting, if you've been on a 3-day Amungadi, our researchers at USARIA measured people before and after a 3-day Amungadi, and your ability to identify and shoot the enemy decreases by 220%. You start shooting at things you do not exist, whether it's friendly fire, you're hallucinating, you're falling asleep, you're micro-sleeping, and you're making bad decisions when you shouldn't shoot, and that goes up 164%. Your errors in decision making go up 86%, and your reaction time decreases 22%. And Mr. Fisher could tell us a reaction time decrease of 22% is what would probably not allow you to have a long-term career in the NFL, and it would actually be the difference of life and death on our battlefield. So we know now that we can actually address this in a deployed setting, and there's strategies we can use to mitigate that risk. And this is one of my passions. My cousin was a scout, and one day on Mother's Day, he had to write 12 mothers' letters of soldiers that weren't coming home. And when I know what we know today about how you can do warfighter fatigue management in theater, I don't know how many of those we could have saved, but I know we could, right? I just in my heart know we can apply that. Well, when you think about the coming home part of this, you know, if we aren't sleeping well in garrison before we deploy, and then we go and the deployment sleep is definitely disrupted because we own the night, right? And then you come back and we haven't taught you what that looks like, we actually are increasing your risk for PTSD and chronic pain. So those without good sleep, PTSD rates go up by 25%. Those with PTSD, their sleep is problematic. That's a bi-directional relationship. When you think about chronic pain, it's also there. And so to me, the spiritual fitness comes into this piece because if you have a sense of meaning, you have a sense of purpose, you have the ability to process everything you've seen in war in a way that actually we gave to you before you deployed. And then we gave you the tools on how to process that with mindfulness and resilience and how to actually take in that information and assess it. Then when you go home, you have a better chance of recovering. And we have the better chance of doing that because we team that up with not just spiritual fitness and resilience, but sleep. And those things go hand in hand. And then when that doesn't work, you can exercise it and make yourself very fatigued to go to sleep and bring in the physical, right? Because we do know exercise really has a huge benefit on decreasing depression and anxiety and stress. And so they all go hand in hand. You can't pull one of them out. But when you think about returning after war, I really would really emphasize sleep and the spiritual fitness and how they play hand in hand.
That's great. I would just add to the fact that, you know, we forge the strongest bonds imaginable in the crucible of combat. And then when we come home, it's trying to recreate that, and which might not ever be possible. But getting back to, as Jeff Green mentioned, the campfire and that community of trust, of brother and sisterhood, and really the purpose as we go back to spirituality, right? Our purpose is very clear in war. It makes life very simple. And then we come back to the complexities of normal life and family and job and commuting in DC and all the things that challenges the core of who we are. And so I would say that is part of what we've seen our generations before us led the way. We probably just need to re-envision it, right? Organizations like the Legion and VFW, where communities were not as fragmented and moving and transient, and that was the place where you could recreate some of that and process. And I think we need some new methodologies because we have a different culture in the 21st century. So we'll transition to a few questions. This one's for you, Dr. Frankel. Can you share how you see trauma impacting resilience, and from your expertise or possible personal experience, and what is what's the way ahead for that?
you guys do remember me saying I'm a physical education teacher, right? I'm going to defer some of this answer because it is out of my scope, but I will say that once trauma is left untreated, definitely physical, but even more so mentally and emotional, it just takes over your entire life. And so now, instead of, we talked earlier about robustness, you're never really back at that baseline level, and you're always working from a deficit component of it. And having conversations where people, it was said I think on the previous panel, people don't mind talking about their ACFT scores. People don't mind talking about, hey, here's my 3RM or here's my VO2 max. They don't like talking about what makes me sad or what keeps me sad or why can't I sleep at night. And that's, in terms of a continuum of care, which I think is the real opportunity for H2F framework, is being in that environment where you start to notice that and then have that ability to not send them off to another building or another facility someplace, but because in a spark or because in a place where everybody's working together, we've started to roll out education courses where we're talking to either small unit leaders or H2F performance teams. Hey, at the end of the workout, when everybody's tired and trying to catch their breath, bring in the chaplain, bring in the nutritionist. People are going, one, they have to be there. Two, they're a little bit fatigued and some of their defenses are down and they're open to listening. And we even talk about having these conversations of, hey, you just had a high intensity workout. Make sure you hydrate, make sure you're eating right. You probably felt like this. At this point, did you give up? Did you feel like you had more left in you when you were done? Hey, how do we address this moving forward? How do we start to use that? And then eventually, it just turns into a broader case. But as I started by saying, trauma left untreated and sometimes trauma left unrecognized, you're working at a deficit the entire time.
Yeah, and cumulative. And as a famous book, A Body Keeps Score. So, and I would just say to that, your point, and I wanted to mention it when Sergeant Major was speaking, because it brought a tear to my eye. A couple weeks ago, I'm in the gym, my team's wearing me out, and I hear this young squad leader. He's got his group and they're finishing up, and that's exactly what he was doing. He was like, "What are you doing for breakfast?" And he was going through the day. He mentioned the tax time's coming up. He if the only thing that would have brought a tear to my eye if he was like, "Hey, are you going to Bible study? Are you going to church?" It would have, I would have broke down right then and there. But it goes to the point of the demands of leaders. And I looked over, and I have two sons in the Army, and I see the world through my lieutenant's eyes and through my NCO's eyes. And in the Army I love, I see the viewpoint, and sometimes it's awesome, and sometimes it's frustrating. But that was one of those points where we put these high demands on young leaders, and they climb over the bar continually, but we're asking them to parent. We were asking them to parent someone who's a couple years younger than them, and they do it. And so whatever we can give them in this domain will set them up for success. General Teyhen, the Army adopts new programs that last 5 to 10 years, like Battle Mind or Assist, and countless others, but abandon them due to a change in senior leadership. What's the Army doing to keep H2F front and center in the years to come?
Well, I do not work in the 5-sided building, so what I would say is I have so much faith in where we're going with our approach to H2F that I think it is definitely enduring. And the reason I say that is that the first physical therapist to go to a Ranger regiment was in 1996. That then went to the Ranger Athlete Warrior Program, and it was so successful, it went to Special Forces. The first physical therapist went to the Special Forces in the early 2000s. Then it became Thor 3 and POTF, right? Then we rolled out Performance Triad, and we realized that that was not going to be sufficient, and now it's H2F. So we've been on this 30-year journey, and I don't care what you call it. And I will tell you, when we first, every division had their version of when Raw was out in Thor 3, right? It was Iron Horse or Mountain Warrior. Like, everyone was coming up with their own version, and we're now investing in it. So to me, the principles are so sound, and they've been through 3 decades of really being well developed, that we have irreversible momentum, but if we don't, when would we? Like, this is 3 decades of work to get here. I think we're at the point where we should say, hey, we can solve this in many different ways, and we can put different names on it as we want to kind of evolve it. That's all right. The principles are the same. It's about leadership that knows how to holistically develop their soldiers so they can fight and win our nation's wars. And we're giving more tools to leaders, and as we get this into the PME program and we indoctrinate it and how we train people to become leaders, they will be just more naturally ready to lead from this front. And Dr. Amy Adler's group at Walter Reed Army Institute of Research can tease out how well leaders know how to lead from an H2F lens and how that actually impacts the performance of that unit. And it's pretty exciting, right? So the better you understand these principles as a leader, the better the whole unit does. And to give you one small example in this, they did a very simple study where all they taught was the leaders about the importance of sleep. But they didn't know they were measuring everybody's sleep. And the whole unit's sleep went up by almost an hour, and they didn't even educate the whole unit. All they did was educate the leaders. So to me, the fact that the Army's putting this in our professional military education, and we're really thinking about how do we institutionalize these principles, the name may change over time. The principles, I think, are at this point part of getting into our DNA. At least that's from my foxhole, sir. I don't know if you agree.
The next question's, it's really asking about the work to continue H2F in conjunction with deployment cycles and kind of the corollary is just like athletic performance. As we equate it to an NFL season or baseball spring training and the ebbs and flows of that life cycle. So how do we do that as we talk about training for war and even in the midst of it?
So, if I were queen for the day, every op order would have a warfighter fatigue management annex to it. And when we started working with units and we were working with the division at Fort Riley, it took us about 3 or 4 field exercises for them to really understand how to implement all these principles to optimize the performance and the recovery of the unit with the field exercise. And they were actually able to show increase the tank crew's ability to shoot expert and actually hit their qualifications after doing about 3 rounds of this. And what was interesting is the unit was not performing optimally at the start. And we were they went back so quickly that the only thing changed was that we actually put these principles in place and did a warfighter fatigue management process with them, and their performance improved. And so it was really kind of an exciting time that both the brigade and division commander was really believing in this. And his question is how do we actually think about making that part of what we do as an institution? How do we actually operationalize the principles of H2F? And again, I don't care if you call it a warfighter fatigue management annex or whatever you call it, but how do you think through the mission and the lens of the human domain so that you optimize the outcome at the end? And I think don't change the mission. The mission's the mission. We got to fight and win our nation's wars. But when we know what we have to do, how do we then apply H2F to do it? And I'll give you 2 examples. One, we've created caffeinated gum. Right? Caffeinated gum is fantastic. It has 100 milligrams of caffeine in it. You get it when you order the more rations. Most folks don't know how to leverage that, how to optimally use it, and yet it actually could be huge on the battlefield. From a nutrition perspective, we order the more rations, which more is an acronym, but it really means when you need more calories than the MRE provides, you can order the more rations. And when we worked with at the time, Colonel Sylvia, now General Sylvia, he was trying to get these rations ordered, and he had a hard time getting them through the system so his soldiers could benefit from it. Well, then we went to, I went to Hawaii next, and we figured out how to get the system to order it. And then the brigade commander there, his name was Rob Ryan, he almost ordered the whole supply for the whole Army in 1 year because his soldiers loved it so much, and it optimized their performance because it was food on the go, right? And it was pudding with a little bit of caffeine in it, applesauce with a little caffeine in it. Like, these were all food on the go, and it improved their performance so much they kept ordering them. How do we actually get the word out on these tools and resources that we have and make sure people know what's available?
I'm just going to come off the bench here real quick. So, you know, this is something we've done in Army aviation forever, right? We realized early on you're operating complex machinery at night, low level, that we had to put some boundaries on, particularly sleep, called fighter management, right? Kind of to your fatigue thing that you're talking about. But it also applies to a tanker, it applies to a surgeon, it applies to anybody who's doing, and every soldier does these technical things out there. So we have pockets of places we have, in fact, done this, and it's done in combat too. In fact, even more so, leveraging combat to do those things. So you know, how we broadcast that out to the rest of the Army is really the question and the value of it. Now, aviators get made fun of all the time. Like, you know, fighter management, yes. And now we got to get over that cultural hurdle that sleep is so important that it affects every other domain that we're talking about here, that we do have to get after that. And we have to figure out structurally in the Army, in combat, how we get after that so that leaders are making good decisions, soldiers are making good decisions, and they're performing better all the time.
I'm going to come at that from a slightly different angle. I actually want to go back to the previous question we were talking about, how to make sure this thing sustains. Coming from a industry background and understanding that there's a branding component of what goes on here. What makes a good brand is what we call knowledge management, whether this is in teaching, is in training. Knowledge management, the simplest things, how do you get the right information to the right people at the right time? And three big buckets are, what's terminology? What terminology are you using? Are we all using the same terminology? And I just want to call out that fatigue management should absolutely, across the board, in military and sports, should be the number one thing. Fatigue management, not just chronically, but short term. How do I manage my fatigue through a workout? When I set people up for a workout, hey, this is what workout's gonna feel like. You're gonna feel like it here, you're gonna feel like here. Your job is to manage your fatigue to be able to get through this in a successful time. Sometimes it's go all out, and now you're just managing your fatigue all out and then figure out how to recover. The other one is having specific protocols. When you show up at a different place, it shouldn't have to be learning a whole new system. I've been on bases where I go from one H2F program to the next, and you would think you're going from one gym that was teaching Zumba to the other one that was teaching 5x5s on there. There is definitely a need for some variability and the opportunity to change things across, but there's got to be some first principles that really address across all these things here. So you got terminology, you got protocols, and then you have expert advice, and that expert advice comes into on the specific MOS or the conditions that you're in. How do you modify those things as you go forward? And then I'll address this question, which may or may not be controversial. Trying to adopt a Division I or a pro sports model, in my opinion, terrible idea. Yep. It leads to unintended consequences, assuming that your population coming in has a similar background of, I know the culture of training, I know the culture of failure, I know the culture of fatigue, I know the culture of discomfort. In a fitness setting, I know the culture of working around a squat rack. I've seen more than a couple of soldiers, Marines, airmen walk near a squat bar when it's moving when they never should. So this whole idea of we want it to look like a Division I or a pro environment also has some other safety concerns in there, because you start to make a H2F or a Spark environment look like a pro lifting station where you've got a bunch of equipment on there, a lot of steel, a lot of equipment, a lot of things packed up. And now, if I'm understanding right, the Spark model is you might have one H2F performance team member to 50, 100, 160 folks. I'll tell you, as of coaching, trying to manage 160 folks is not going to go well. I've talked to some of my colleagues at big universities, University of Texas. I said, hey, what's the most you've ever had in this weight room? He goes, oh, one time we had 80 people in here. And I said, well, how'd that go? He goes, not too bad. We had 17 coaches and we were all used to doing these things. So it's a different behavioral environment. And then once again, as you start to get, the whole goal is, especially with 7 dash, and we're talking about getting strength touches on there, how do you do not the minimal effective dose, but the optimal effective dose of getting brutal in the basics? And Mr. Posey talked about it earlier, this whole idea of what he called movement patterns, what we kind of term foundational movements, and in a big fancy word, we call them attractor states, meaning I know what a squat looks and feels like, I know what a hinge looks and feels like. The gentleman from the Detroit Lions talked about climbing and crawling. Those are foundational movement patterns as well. How do we teach those in a way that it doesn't matter if you've got a 45,000 square foot Spark, or you show up and you give me a bar soap, a baggie, and a toothbrush, and I can train you because I understand the first principles across there. I would say that's, in my view, that's the biggest risk I see with H2F and other human performance programs, or if we don't have an infrastructure of knowledge management, the risk of it going away becomes based on, do we have the equipment, are we resourced, as opposed to, do we have the knowledge and expertise to scale this across the board?
That's great, yeah. What I hear you saying is the program isn't the focus, it's the top line.
It's the human element and how we're communicating those things across.
And I'll weigh in on the ebbs and flows of training as we look at spirituality. Just like war, we don't control most of the ebbs and flows, the challenges, the valleys we go to, right? We can't control losing a loved one. You know, we can't predict a relationship. Well, sometimes we can't predict a relationship breaking up. Oftentimes we can. You all know what I'm talking about. But those things are going to come, and maximizing the time on the mountaintop to sustain you through the valley becomes essential. And I would say it expands over to behavioral, mental, all emotional as well. So let me just pose this question to you here, and I'm going to begin with a quote, and we'll just see, because we've explored a little bit of this already. This is a quote from a journalist, and he said this: "I know we have the machines to fight this war, but the question is, do we have the guts? This generation isn't mentally prepared to bridge the gap between the comforts of peace and the horrors of war." Now, that is not a recent statement. That was written by journalist Robert Sherrod in the early days of World War II. So he's speaking of the greatest generation, whether they had the ability to transition to war. So each the older generation is always telling folks to get off their lawn, and that's just how it is. However, we always have cultural and generational strengths and challenges to overcome, and we've highlighted a few of those. And what do you see as some of the challenges that we might need to overcome?
I'll start and be relatively brief on this. And we talked about this, having our youngest being 19 years old, and understanding that not only from a physical capability, they're not like previous generations. On the other side of that, their ability to use technology and get feedback loops and behaviors, while a lot of times now I think instead of the old folks saying get off the lawn, we're saying get off the phone. And there is some value in that, but the information they are gathering through that is good. I think where challenges lie, opportunities are waiting to be found. It's not on this generation or this young generation to be about previous generations. The onus is on us, me as a human performance practitioner and expert, and everybody else in leadership, is to train them to be durable, robust, resilient, and adaptive given the realities of today. And that means getting over these hurdles of coming in and seeing stress fractures and femoral heads from rucking, oh my God, and understanding that the training has to take place in a way that takes advantage of that, and the way they're consuming information is not what we have traditionally done in terms of a so-called expert sitting up in front of a room and talking at them. It's now, God forbid, it's TikTok and it's Instagram, but if that's how they're consuming it, how do we meet them there, or at least meet them halfway? That's on us.
A good friend of mine who taught at West Point was at TRADOC, Dr. Chip East. He wrote a book on the history of physical fitness, and it's about 300 pages on why we do physical fitness. And it's a fascinating book, but what it principally comes down to is that the most important thing that armies way back started to do by integrating physical fitness was it's the 1 hour a day to wake up the warrior spirit. And it's the 1 hour a day you have to holistically prepare that soldier for war and realize that they're the most prized weapon system on the battlefield. And if you've ever gone to a PT session and you're doing knee circles, you're not waking up your warrior spirit.
But you're getting ankle dorsiflexion.
But you're getting some ankle dorsiflexion. But if you're going there with leaders who know that they have 1 hour to wake up that warrior spirit and get them ready to understand that they're the most prized weapon system on the battlefield, then you are integrating sleep, activity, nutrition, mental, and spiritual into that. You are giving them a spiritual focus as part of how you give that physical fitness session. And you're not having them walk up and down the road because they're on profile and you don't know what else to do with them. And so you're just having them walk out of convenience instead of actually using that 1 hour a day to wake up the warrior spirits. To me, culturally, we have to have folks truly understand the power of what H2F brings them. And this idea that if you integrate that all and you go in with the philosophy that we're here to wake up their inner spirit, their warrior spirit, the reason they joined our army to defend our nation and win our nation's wars. And this is the hour I consistently have every day. It's not the most important thing we do today, it's the most important thing we do every day, right? That's a trademark, it's the most important thing we do every day. And going in with that, without the daily dozen mentality, that we're going here and we're just kind of pushed through the hour and we're going to kind of all endure it, but we're going there with a purpose to wake up the warrior spirit, I think that's where the secret sauce will happen, and when people realize that that's the goal. I used to teach that when I taught the company commander first sergeant course at Schofield. And I was amazed at how many first sergeants would find my office before they left the installation, and they said, "Ma'am, you're right. The soldiers that know that they are the most prized weapon system on the battlefield are not my problem children." And every day I get a chance to make more of my soldiers feel like they're the most prized weapon on the battlefield, I have less and less problems in my unit over time. And so to me, that's where we want to get.
Great. Great points, both of you. And I would just add the added benefit is we all experience setbacks and failures. And doing what you just said, ma'am, together every day, we realize, oh, I can push through. I failed. I got to failure, and I know what that feels like, and then maybe I can give it a little bit more. And tomorrow I'm a little bit stronger, and not just physically, but mentally, spiritually, emotionally, in all of our domains. Just secret sauce, absolutely. Well, I want to thank you both. I mean, the points that you have made is just helping all of us think through what does it mean to thrive, not just survive? What does it mean to confront the hardest challenges maybe of this life in ground combat? And how we can help our soldiers to do it better, to endure through victory and return home well. And I appreciate both of your comments and filling in the gaps and what sickness has taken from us. And so thank you, and I just give them a big round of applause.
Well, since you guys have been such a great crowd, we have a